Patrick. I show 7 a.m. here in the United States. I welcome everybody and welcome you to begin the webinar today, if you wish.
Perfect. Thank you, Tim. I will turn my camera on for the time being. Next slide, please, Matt, if that's okay. Yes, so Patrick Malléjacq speaking here from PIARC. So a couple of housekeeping recommendations. Please turn your camera and microphone off unless you are speaking as one of the panelists. You are very welcome to ask questions in the chat. At the end of all topics, there are a number of topics that structure the webinar today. Being from FHWA in the USA, we'll check the chat and ask questions to the panelists. Maybe we will not be able to answer all questions due to the large number of participants, but we'll do our best. And there's a number of tips related to how to use Zoom, but I guess everyone's rather familiar with that now. So please check your microphones and your cameras and turn that off unless you are one of the panelists. So this is basically the same thing. And another recommendation is to check how your name appears in Zoom. It's best that your full name and maybe even your country is mentioned there so that people know who they are interacting with. Thank you very much. It's very easy to do in Zoom. And again, I guess you're familiar with that now. Next slide, please. Thank you, Matt. So this is me, Patrick Malléjacq, Secretary General of PIARC. I will briefly introduce you to PIARC activities. Next slide. Yeah, so PIARC or PIARC, depending on where you live, is the new name of the World Road Association. We were founded more than 110 years ago, so 112 years now, as a non-profit, non-political association. Our goal is really, we have one goal, to organize the exchange of knowledge on all matters related to roads and road transport. We have, as lead members, governments from 124 countries, as well as regions, private sector companies, research organizations, engineering companies, and individuals. And we think that we are the first global forum for the exchange of knowledge, policy and practice on roads and road transport. And the way we work is through committees and experts. Next slide, please. Experts such as, yeah, perfect, thank you, Matt. Experts such as those, when the COVID crisis struck, we decided to set up a response team. And you have here on the slide the names and actually pictures of all the colleagues who have been working with us under the chairmanship of Christos Xenophontos from Rhode Island DOT in the USA, and myself. We shared that honor, and we've been able to organize some activities. And as you can see here on that slide, we have experts from all over the world, basically representing various cultures and sensibilities, as well as various fields of expertise. Next slide, please, Matt. Yeah. We organized more than 20 webinars. Actually, we're closer to 30 now, in English mostly, but also in French and Spanish on various topics. Some of those webinars were more discussion opportunities for the community, the road community worldwide. Others were more focused on freight and logistics, for example. Next slide, please. Yeah. So these webinars were organized with panelists from the network of PIARC members. So experts from PIARC committees, experts from PIARC national committees, including AASHTO in the USA, of course. AASHTO has been very instrumental and helpful in this effort, as well as partner organizations that agreed to join our webinars in order to bring added value, new input, new ways of looking at things, and broadening our questions from road to infrastructure in general or transportation in general, and maybe even other topics as well. This has been really, really helpful. And I invite all of you to check the recordings of those webinars on our website. Next slide, please. We have been able, based on these webinars, to develop a detailed technical report. That report is available from our website as well. We call this Initial Impacts and Responses from Road and Transport Agencies. What is included there is an in-depth analysis of the crisis and its consequences on roads, road operations, freight transport, ITS systems, etc. Recommendations based on best practice from all over the world, as well as implementation measures that look to the future. It was published 3 months ago now. It's already available in English, of course, as well as Spanish and French. And that's the link, but I will share it later on in the chat. Thank you. Next slide, please. And that's where I stop. my speech. Thank you very much to all the excellent colleagues who've been organizing this. Our colleagues from Committee 1.2, which is Road and Transport Planning for Economic and Social Development, chaired by Fabio Pasquali, who will be presenting a bit later, and Tim Henkel, of course, from the same committee. Tim, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Patrick, for that intro, and good morning, everybody, from the Midwest U.S. city of St. Paul. As Patrick said, my name is Tim Henkel, and I am an assistant commissioner at the Minnesota Department of Transportation here in Minnesota. The sun is just rising here in St. Paul, and I think this new day is a perfect backdrop to the PIARC webinar that we have titled Post-COVID, Planning for Economic Recovery. I'll first take a few minutes just to set the stage and quickly summarize the topics and the speakers that we have today so we can get right into the subject matter. First, to set the stage, the COVID-19 pandemic has, I think we all believe, accelerated key trends that directly affect transportation, and it is truly presenting transportation and transportation planners with an unprecedented set of new challenges and real possibilities. This event is really unique from past economic downturns in terms of the impact because its scope and its scale literally touches all sectors of the economy across the world. It's also notable for how the response to restrictions like the social distancing that we're all facing has really led transportation planners to think about how we live, how and where we work, as well as travel. For example, it appears that there is much more awareness of our values for areas like health, human interactions, as well as the environment. It's clear now that all of us in the transportation industry are currently and will continue to be challenged to consider the role of transportation in an evolving, what I refer to as new normal. That includes differing views on personal, economic, as well as societal priorities. It's also clear that the pandemic and the associated mitigation policies are really affecting travel behavior, as well as the attitudes of all of us. For example, transportation planners are seeing changes that include significant shifts in transportation demand, as well as supply and the overall performance of transportation. While it's impossible for transportation planners to forecast which of these changes are really going to stick, I believe that approaches to planning transportation system, as well as investments, must be evaluated and transformed. This webinar was organized, as Patrick said, by the members of the PIARC Tech 1.2 committee, and we are working this cycle to identify, to investigate, and then document the emerging methods, practices, and guidelines for determining the economic and social contribution of road transport systems. While the Tech 1.2 efforts are focused primarily on non-pandemic case study, we recognize that changes associated with the pandemic will require immediate planning, as well as prioritization and implementation to adapt to post-COVID recovery. As such, the presenters that we have today offer examples that are intended to inform you about and help to give you as participants an understanding of and assist planning for post-COVID recovery, including economic tools, methods, and processes for evaluating a wide spectrum of possible future COVID recovery scenarios, and to assist transportation planners' ability to pivot swiftly and respond to future change. My hope is that this webinar assists you to confidently determine the best path to assess, to address, as well as to manage the economic and social needs and impacts of the post-COVID world. The agenda today is divided into 3 topics. You've all had a chance to see that on the PIARC website. We'll have 2 presentations per topic, and we will have a Q&A after each one of those topic areas and after the presenters have completed their presentations. We've allotted 2.5 hours to this total webinar. We're going to be challenged to keep it to 2.5, but we're going to work hard to do that. Please bear with us if we go slightly over that time, as I believe the content is incredibly important and useful to those of you that are participating today. You can see that the topics include trends and planning considerations. I have some background to provide to start that out, and I welcome our speaker, Lincoln Flor, with the World Bank, as well as we then move into topic 2, predicting the post-COVID world. Fabio Pasquali with ANAS Italy will be kicking that off and helping to facilitate that session. As Patrick said, Fabio is the president, the chair of the technical committee 1.2. We then move to Peter Plumeau, as well as Frank Bruns with EPB out of the US and Switzerland. And then we move to topic 3, finalizing the presentations with some case studies and perspectives. I'll kick that off. We'll move to Joseph, who is with the Minneapolis Federal Bank, and Dejan Makovsek with OECD. We will have time to conclude and have a summary of what we've covered, and then Patrick will close out this session at the end of the webinar. Next slide, please. Please note that during Peter and Frank's presentation today, we will use Mentimeter. In an effort to simplify our work and to be prepared, I ask that you take a snapshot of this slide, write down the code, log into Mentimeter. We'll be using Mentimeter as the survey tool to make this a little more interactive. So use code 94524025 and log in to www.mentimeter.com in advance so we can move through that presentation in a timely manner. Next slide. All right, let's move quickly into the first topic area, which we have titled U.S. Transportation Trends and Planning Considerations. This segment, as I said, is intended to provide a general overview, and it will give you the perspective of the US first, and then we'll move into perspectives on Latin America, and Lincoln with the World Bank will help us with that. These presentations are really intended to help you understand the impact of COVID on transportation and the economy, give you perspectives on planning considerations for post-COVID recovery, and to help you to begin to transition from the mindset that has been to date really the COVID response to a mindset of planning for post-COVID economic recovery. So I'll start my presentation on the COVID area US transportation trends, where I think we left off. I believe it was October of last year when the AASHTO executive director, Jim Timon, last presented with Patrick and Christos on the PIARC and COVID-19 response, one of the many COVID response webinars that were held last year. As you can see from this slide, the COVID-19 statistics for the USA are really quite dramatic. Deaths associated with the pandemic have nearly tripled, while the cases have quadrupled since the March data was provided last year. The most recent peak in cases and deaths occurred just a few months ago Next slide. COVID-19's impact on transportation in the US is also quite startling. Telecommuting and e-commerce adoption appear to have reduced passenger vehicle miles traveled through the summer of 2020. And while travel remains below pre-COVID levels, passenger vehicle travel appears to be returning to near normal levels. Yet most of the DOTs are reporting that traffic congestion is not as bad as that experienced pre-COVID, in particular during the travel peak periods, as travel patterns have apparently shifted in association with the permanent shifts to work at home patterns and the key commercial centers, while increasing off-peak traffic in other areas. Next slide, please. And the impact of COVID-19 on transit ridership is even more dramatic, probably the most dramatic here in the US. Transit ridership fell on average in the US over 80% since February of 2020, with some systems seeing drop-offs of 90% or greater. Here is an example of the 80% drop-off. This data comes from Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority ridership in Matt's backyard. Next slide, please. It's also important to note that during the pandemic, many micro mobility companies have modified or have been forced to end important transportation services as the demand has fallen for trips in many locations. This data is depicted by bike share and e-scooter data from the World Road Association. You can take a look at the dramatic changes that are occurring to the number of systems that have closed permanently and those that have suspended operations, as well as those that have remained fiscally viable and remained open. Next slide, please. And we're seeing that transportation trends associated with COVID-19 have impacted the ability for US DOTs to address system preservation, capital needs, maintenance needs, operation needs, as well as administrative everyday needs. This slide shows the total actual and forecast US state transportation revenues. The solid blue line is actual historic revenue, and the dashed blue represents the pre-COVID and trend-based revenue forecast, which is a 10-year rolling average. Please note that this graphic includes data that is based on the initial AASHTO conducted survey that was done in June of last year. And at that time, very little was known about how the pandemic and mobility restrictions were actually going to evolve. Since the baseline was acquired back in June, the AASHTO has updated that information with actual data, as well as made revisions based on another survey that was conducted in January of 2021, which is the darker orange line on this graphic. According to the AASHTO survey of all of the US DOTs that was conducted back in January, we estimate that approximately 28 billion, that's billion with a B, of loss of state transportation revenues between 2020 out through 2024. Next slide, please. And despite the global nature of the pandemic, the impacts vary from DOT to DOT across the US, as represented by this World Road Association graphic. DOT's respective revenue portfolios also responded differently to the stresses created by the pandemic. As DOTs begin to recover from the COVID revenue impacts, it's my opinion that many DOTs and state legislatures will evaluate their individual revenue portfolios and then will consider some potential post-COVID recovery financial management strategies. Next slide, please. We've learned a lot since March last year. As stated in this slide, COVID impacts are different depending on where you are in the US. That said, overall, we have seen traffic decreases. We've seen, however, speeding and crashes increase and fatalities increase, with significant concerns about our safety performance targets and the impact that the COVID pandemic is having. Traffic is returning to normal levels. Congestion has been significantly reduced. The question is, can we maintain a transportation system that continues to see significantly reduced congestion, as it appears that the reduction in congestion of 5 to 10% has created some fairly free flow conditions in the US. To maintain that would not be all that difficult. Doing that from a policy perspective, maybe, however. Next slide, please. So what do these trends mean? Here are some post-recovery takeaways, starting with the future travel pattern considerations. There are just a few intended to help us navigate the realities of post-COVID recovery. First, consider that working from home is likely to be a more significant mode choice. From a broad perspective, the pandemic has changed the way we use transportation to conduct our daily lives. Second, consider that transit and mobility services will likely change. Changes in societal attitudes regarding health and its connection to social distancing and crowding is likely to increase the importance of quality of service factors, like the desire for rider space on buses, or simply avoiding bus and train riding and associating crowding altogether. At the same time, transit agencies and their funders are facing some of the most significant fiscal issues that they've faced in many, many years. And if that persists post-COVID, it will further cause problems and challenges in the long term. Next, please consider new travel patterns and social equity needs. Many transportation planning concepts, from capacity investments to right-sizing strategies for readjusting capacity, will likely rely on forecasts of future growth. And social equity will become a more important element of transportation prioritization and our planning process. Decarbonization of transportation is another consideration. There may also be persistent shifts in how we prioritize policies affecting environmental quality and personal interactions in the future, including opportunities to decarbonize transportation. Major decarbonization pathways for transportation include things like lower carbon fuels, improving vehicle efficiency, improving system-wide efficiency, and including the use of autonomous vehicles and vehicle sharing. And last but not least, there is a need to consider planning for future scenarios. Changes in all of the considerations that I've listed and discussed will be, in my humble opinion, affecting at least 3 elements of our planning in the future: service and facility design, project prioritization, and long-term planning. In the interest of time, I'm going to end there with that summary of considerations and move to our next speaker. I will now give the podium to Lincoln Flor. Lincoln, would you please begin your presentation by introducing yourself, your affiliation and background, and the topic of your presentations. Welcome. Good morning.
Good morning, team. Good afternoon, good evening, colleagues in the world. Thank you for the invitation. Please, can we see the next slide? My name is Flor. I work for the World Bank in the transport unit. Now I'm working in the Latin America program. I used to have also very good experience in other regions like Africa, South Asia, Eastern Europe. And today we are going to discuss what is the bank doing in developing countries with a little bit of focus on Latin America. Next slide. This is the agenda that we will try to cover. We have only a few minutes, but let's go to the next slide. COVID-19 has impacted the developing countries very severely, including Latin America. This year, we expect a very moderate growth, that is only less than 4%. In terms of the transport, especially the road transport, we see that there is a lot of uncertainty in the travel demand. We can see that skilled workers are not using urban transport or road transport in the way that they used to travel in the past. And in the side of the supply, we see that many operators are broke in the region. So in the coming years, it's going to be very challenging, no? And look to innovative ways to see how we can support the demand and the supply in the region. We have a lot of work done in this first year, during the pandemic, but we see that the impacts will be high in the next years. And the most important thing is, and very concerned, is the jobs. We see that people are losing a lot of jobs and for a long time, and this is eroding the human capital of Latin America and also other regions. Different policies have been implemented, no? But we need to be very realistic. Employment is changing. Different measures and programs have been implemented by governments now. Latin America and emerging markets and advanced economies now are having more coordination in these kind of policies. Now standards and practices are to prevent and mitigate COVID impacts in road transport are implemented. One that's PIARC is playing a key role in this area. Growth in the next 10 years is going to be low compared with the previous year. This means that the economies will be very weak this year in the coming years. Next slide. In the bank, we see that infrastructure and road infrastructure is a key instrument for growth, for reduce inequality, and also for competitiveness. So there is a lot of evidence that we have worked in the past and now, and see that the instruments, one of the instruments that we need to implement better with more efficiency are those related with road infrastructure. Why roads and not airports? Because as you know that airports are now suffering, are bleeding. So we don't expect that the airport transport or the airline transport will be one of the key sectors this year or in the coming years. Also for the employment generation that I will explain later. Next. Yeah, we have checked, we have been working with several countries in Latin America, for example, Argentina, and we have evidence how investments in roads, especially, for example, in rural roads or highways, can generate more productivity, efficiency, employment, and growth compared with other projects like metro lines. No, that most of the employment for metro lines is generated outside of the country and not in Argentina. So we have Argentina, one of our cases, and also I will present in the next slide, please. Next slide, Colombia. As maybe you know, Colombia in the last years has been involved in a big program in the fourth generation of roads under PPP schemes, no? From the previous government of Colombia, there have been a lot of work and finance, no, for different roads in the country. But during the pandemic, no, there were many challenges in terms of the risk allocation of these projects. No, we have been working with the Colombian government, no, to see what are the scenarios and how we are going to fix these PPP contracts and what is the way that we are going to renegotiate, no, to ensure the continuity of these roads. In this case, for example, the demand risk will stay with the government, and the government will compensate the concessionaires. And there is several mechanisms that have been implemented, no, to ensure that these projects will continue and will complete. And also the construction risks, for example, will keep in the private side, yeah. And sometimes the government is giving extensions, no, to compensate that delays that is as a consequence of COVID. Most of these projects have liquidity issues, no. So one of the instruments that we are helping also the Colombia is how to implement instruments that can provide liquidity for the continuity of these projects. We are doing not only this work with Colombia that has this large program. We are doing also with Peru that they have been implemented several framework, no, to ensure that the continuity of the PPP road concessions and also the new road concession will have the necessary changes, no, and the new criteria to ensure that we are going to have private investments and financial flows in the coming years. Next, please. So there are several strategies that we are implementing in the short term. For example, the fiscal stimulus that in the way like cash transfer, no, that families can continue demanding services and goods. There are some critics about that because this is impacting the level of debt in the countries. And sometimes there are poor projects that are having these resources, no? And maybe they will impact the efficiency of the country. In the long term, we are working with clients, no, on digital infrastructure to make sure that we can expand the coverage in the country. We are supporting logistics to ensure that the goods are coming to the main cities and the distribution is guaranteed. And also the transport integration. We have many cities that have different modes, and these modes are not integrated. And we are working to create efficiencies and providing productivity to these systems. Next slide, please. Yeah, so we are changing our mind. I think it's a time to rethink, you know, how we are going to address these challenges, in particular these changes in the demand and the shift of modes. You know, more people are using bikes in Latin America, but also we are increasing the risk on road safety. So this needs a lot of support, not only the way that we are using not motorizing modes, but also we need to increase the capacity of our governments to strengthen the road safety agenda in these countries. The bank has mobilized important financing, no? 160 billion in the last 15 months, and around 4.6 billion in the region. And one of the priorities that we are working, that we see that roads will play a key role in the economic recovery. We have evidence, not recent evidence, from different countries, from the north of Africa and also from Argentina, and we have identified that rural roads and roads could create thousands of employment compared to other kind of infrastructure. So in this way, we think that we are helping our clients to address these COVID impacts, and we expect that in the coming years, the efficiency and the productivity and all these new reforms will be implemented to reduce poverty that has been increasing in the last months, and also to reduce inequality. Next. Oh, thanks, team. I give you the floor now.
Thank you for that excellent presentation, Lincoln. I'm going to move us to Bing. Bing is helping us with Q&A, as is Dr. Matt Hardy with AASHTO, who's running the PowerPoint. Thank you, Matt, for responding to some of the chat box. Bing, I'll give it to you for a couple of minutes to see if there are any questions in the chat box that we can respond to verbally, and or any other needs that you have, Bing.
Great. Thank you, team. First, I want to encourage everyone, please feel free to type your question in the chat box with the name of the presenters there, so I can tell which question to address to which presenters. Next, let me read the questions. We got one question addressed at team from Gilbert Hacker. Did I understand it right? Accident figures went up during pandemic. It was the other way around in Germany. This question, we got a response from Patrick, from Matthew Hardy, and from Crystals. Do you want to chime in verbally, or do you want me just read out your comments? I would appreciate if you can talk, since you are presented in this event. Let's start with Patrick.
Yeah, there was a question about road safety in particular, and I would invite everyone to check the webinar we organized in October last year, which was devoted to road safety. And indeed, in many countries, we witnessed an increase in accidents during the crisis, and that's due, that's a simple reason, right? And there are other reasons. So the simple one that seems to be applicable here is that people saw empty roads and empty streets, and they decided to speed up. That's in a nutshell, but I invite everyone to check our webinar, the video recording, and the presentations from PIARC.org. Thanks. Thank you.
Matthew?
Sorry, I was just answering on behalf of Tim. In the U.S., we are seeing an increase. The preliminary data for calendar year 2020 is an increase in crashes, an increase in both serious injuries and fatalities. What's more concern, not more concerning, but also concerning, is the decrease in VMT is resulting in higher rates, so fatality and serious injury rates as well. The other aspect that I was going to sort of type in also is vulnerable road users, so bike and peds. We saw an increase in that as well for calendar year 2020. So all of this is sort of preliminary, and there are lots of people smarter than me kind of looking at it and trying to analyze it and trying to figure out, you know, why is this occurring, and then what can we do to mitigate it, fix it. And as Christo said, is it here to stay, or is this just a result of the pandemic? And once we go back to pre-pandemic, congestion levels and stuff like that, we'll sort of level out again. We don't know, but we're looking into it.
Thanks, Matt. I just want to clarify with you, does this mean the number of fatalities and the serious injuries is up in 2020 compared to 2019, but the rate increased much higher because of
Correct.
lower VMT.
Correct. Yeah, because you get that denominator and numerator interaction going on. Correct. Yeah.
Great. Next, Christos, do you want to add something about the Rhode Island study?
Yeah, thank you, Bing. And this is something that actually came out of our Office of Highway Safety, in that accidents are caused primarily by behavior, by driver behavior. So what we would like to do is actually initiate a research project, and we're working on identifying funding for that right now, to look at what changed in the driver behavior during the pandemic, and to really see whether it's here to stay and what do we need to do in order to make sure that it actually does not stay. So we'll keep people posted as we move forward, but I'm hoping that we can actually get it funded and look into it.
Great, thanks. I know Gilbert Baker posted another comment, said our explanation, it's less traffic, less accidents. Do you want to chime in on this, Gilbert?
Yeah, so that's welcome, Gilbert from Germany. That's our simple explanation. We had about 25% less traffic, and that leads, in our opinion, or we know that leaded to less accidents, less fatalities. So we hope that it will not be a singular event, because we do a lot for traffic safety over here as well, but it seems to be the important influence in last year's figures seem to be the traffic figures overall.
Thanks. Any other question?
Bing, I would only add that in Minnesota, as an example, we have seen the same trend that we see in overall United States figures as represented in my slide. We've seen an increase in crashes, increase in speed. It's the speed that appears to be killing people, literally. And we have seen some significant speeds in this state that are notable in the 100-mile-an-hour category. So it's fairly obvious that that's a contributor, but certainly all of us, as Christos is saying, need to study this further to understand why, under a condition of less traffic, we would see the increases that we have been seeing. Bing, if we don't have any additional questions, and in the interest of time, we could move on to the next segment. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure. Okay, I want to thank our excellent panelist team and Lincoln. Next, let's move on to topic number 2, predicting the post-COVID-19 world. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to hand the podium over to Fabio and ask Fabio to provide some introductory remarks and perspectives and take us into this topic, predicting the post-COVID world. Welcome, Fabio.
Thank you, Tim. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for attending, and thanks to PIARC and my colleagues in the PRTC 1.2 committee for having organized it together with myself this webinar. Well, in addition to my PIARC assignments, I'm head of planning in ANAS. ANAS is the Italian state road agency with responsibility of some 30,000 kilometers on network and a budget for investments in the next 5 years in excess of 30 to 32 billion euros. And I'm an economist. Well, I'll try to be assertive in order to provide some points, some elements to think about for this coming years. Next slide, please, Matt. Thank you. this is just a trend. Well, it's useful to see it. It's the traffic in 50% of the Italian toll motorway network, but it's representative of the 100% more or less, we can say. Well, as we know, during the full lockdown period, there was lack of traffic, but what is interesting is that even when the mobility restriction measures have been lowered, traffic did not get again to the same level. And after that period, and we are in the two last quarters, when it's quite impossible to understand which is the trend, we have a high variety in month to month or even week to week traffic. So the first conclusion is that, well, we don't know what normality is, neither the old one nor the new one. New normality so far is an utopia. Next, please. So I just prepared 6 topics in 3 slides. So the first one, what will we lose in terms of traffic is not a doubt, just it's a certainty. Well, let us consider the most important components of trips in any mobility analysis. Students, commuters, and businessmen will produce in the next future and now, not only now, less trips. Students, because of the option of remote distance learning, which will probably be mandatory in all universities, at least in Europe, as far as I know, in order to allow students to follow without traveling and without moving to another city. Commuters will certainly be given some options to go on the distance-based work schemes. And businessmen will travel less because of the use of meeting platforms, which we have been using so far. And let us not forget that businessmen form a very important part of the market for high-speed train and flights and rich segments of traffic demand. Students and commuters are essential for any metropolitan area transport analysis. Well, as to the other segments, we are sure that commercial traffic and leisure flows will remain the same. More precisely, will probably follow GDP as it usually happens. We don't know that much about customers in the sense that mobility related to the purchase of goods, well, will partly be affected by the huge use of e-commerce we have been used for in these months. Well, we don't know yet the extent. But let us not forget that this decrease in traffic flows will depend on several factors, but it's very different if we consider it in the urban or metropolitan areas and the rest of the other parts of the countries. For the rest of the country, I think that we will not see major changes in traffic patterns in the next future. But let us not forget that most of our projects are devoted to solve problems related to needs which emerge in metropolitan areas. Second main topic, integration of infrastructures, is not a trend, is a reality. We tend to finance more intermodal hubs, both for passengers and goods. I'm not saying that because ANAS, the company I work for, has been integrated with the National Railway Company of Italy 3 years ago, but it's a common trend in many countries, and it's a way of saving money. You try to optimize your planning, considering different needs and different modes, and if possible, a good working hub, not only for one segment of demand. And the second interesting fact is that following the pandemic, one of the most important legacies of the pandemic is the collaboration which has been established between different transport mode operators and administrative bodies. Well, this collaboration is a good basis for planning together, or at least listening each other in order to take the right decision considering different needs. Then, third thing, possible transport service or management by road agencies and operators. As we will say a few minutes from now, we are urgently needing more money, more financial resources. One possible option is to become operator of hubs, also for other modes or in association with other operators, or even operators of transport services. Then last but not least, ITS. Well, ITS is changing the picture a lot, and partly also the project economics in the sense that it reduces costs in adds new sources of revenue, although the business model is not yet clear to all players. Next slide, please. Thanks, Matt. Well, two other topics. First one is the agenda for decarbonization. Well, we all know that we are trying to decrease emissions, and the electric vehicles, and in a farther future, automatic drive vehicles. Well, this is and will reduce the excises and the oil-based excises, of course. And this is it's not possible to avoid it, even though it's an issue more for high GDP countries. It will become common to all countries as soon as the agenda will be extended with a strong financial effort in all countries. So we all need a new way to fund both our ordinary activities and the investments for our next future. I'm sure that we will discuss worldwide new or a sole possible generalized road pricing scheme. It could be either distance-based or emission-based, or something like a logistic fee per mile or per kilometer, and or per ton transported by commercial vehicles. It's not possible to defer this discussion because during the pandemic, all road agencies realized how important it is to have a regular source of revenues, and if this revenue source ceases to exist, well, the countries may increase their debt, but it's not an option, as our friend from the World Bank said, is not an option that can be maintained for a long future. Road projects assessment and selection. What has changed for the future and for now? First of all, if we want to if we really believe in the decarbonization agenda, we have to consider different parameters in our cost-benefit analysis. We all know that benefits from emission range from 10 to 15% on average. The remaining part of benefits being linked to the transport time savings associated to different players. Well, if we want to have more green projects, we have to start from this particular situation to reconsider some of our parameters, as has been done, for instance, in some countries where discount rates have been changed in order to take into consideration the importance of next generations. Also, time values need a inquiry in order to update them. Well, then innovation and integration being put together is a prerequisite for each project. We have to start, avoid being a silos. We have to listen to other players and to take right decision. Then extracting value from different areas and assets is nothing new at all, but we have to be more careful in trying and find these sources from the very beginning. Next one, please. Well, this is the last trend and topic slide. Well, funding and PPPs. I'm sure that we are going to welcome a new season for PPPs with more flexibility in contracts. We know that the pandemic has been considered as force majeure only in a limited number of countries, and that both clients and banks have shown a highly heterogeneous behavior with respect to the shortfall of revenues experienced by a concession company. And some terms of the contract will partially be open. We know, for instance, that in some countries, concession have been extended, franchise time has been extended. And so it may be that in the present and in the next future, this part of the contract will be open in the sense that if something unpredictable occurs, then some parameters of the contract will automatically be renegotiated, not rechanged, but renegotiated at least. And then mechanisms for considering extra costs and revenues sharing, which are usual, of course, will be regular in the new contract. And then a wider scope for the concession would be welcome in my view. Why don't we open to joint ventures, which include also developers in the real estate activity? We are used to have a special purpose company made by contractors and operators and financial players sometimes, but we do need, in my view, to put in also the other developers in order to increase value. Then, last but not least, as agencies, we had to get to be fast in responding to the market by using simplified procedure and reinforcement of internal capabilities. Last consideration, options for a road agency. I want to be a little bit provocative. Defensive versus aggressive behavior. Well, defensive is just looking for the revenues and working to the backlog, for the backlog. But aggressive one is just to, in few words, to be open and collaborative, to be innovation-based, to be PPP-oriented, and then to be ready, in some cases, to reconsider our cost-benefit analysis parameters and to compare negative NPVs or very low benefit-based NPVs. This is just a stimulus that I want to give. I give you to Flor, Tim. Thank you for your attention. Thank you. I thank Matt.
Thank you, Fabio, for that excellent introduction and those perspectives. Looking forward to a little bit of Q&A regarding some of those perspectives when we get through this particular topic. Let me quickly move to our next presenter for topic 2, and Peter Plumeau and Frank Bruns. Please introduce yourselves, your affiliations, and move into your topic. Welcome.
Very good. Thank you, Tim. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Peter Plumeau, and I am the president and CEO of EBP US, which is part of the EBP global family of companies. I'm very pleased to be here today with my colleague, Frank Bruns, who's going to give part of this presentation in a bit. He is our team leader for transportation economics and financing with EBP Switzerland. And I know EBP may not be a familiar name to many, so just very quickly, we're a global firm with locations in Europe, Asia, South America, and the US. And our service lines include providing advanced economic analysis and research to support planning and policy across different transportation modes and infrastructure more generally. So today, we're going to discuss the role of transportation investment in post-COVID economic recovery and growth. But before we move into our presentation, as Matt mentioned earlier, we're going to use Mentimeter to ask you a few quick questions that'll just help us better understand your perspectives as we move through the presentation. So first of all, the first question is, where are you located? And just giving you a few options there, and take a minute just for people to respond. Okay, it's looking like mostly Europe and North America so far, one South America. Oh, Africa, okay. Okay, great. So we kind of, this helps us maybe understand the audience a little more for today, that we're primarily North America and Europe, with a few folks from Africa and South America in the mix as well. Okay, let's go to the next question if we could, Matt. So thinking about, recovering from COVID, in terms of transportation investment and planning, what one aspect of that concerns you the most? And a few options here. Let's see what folks say. So funding, the obvious one, funding shortfalls, and keeping pace with change. Not really a big surprise there. That's what I would kind of assume with this audience and what we're seeing around the world ourselves. Traveler behavior change, obviously linked to, all of these are interlinked, obviously, but yeah, funding shortfalls, definitely a concern. I can see that. Okay, Matt, one more before we move into our presentation. So in thinking about the way you may invest in transportation post-COVID, what are you thinking may be the most effective way to direct investment? And there, again, there's a few objectives listed here. Just be interested in your feedback on that. Mm-hmm. Okay, so it looks like there's a sort of a strong trending towards investing to adapt to changing travel demand, but also some thinking about strengthening supply chains and providing jobs directly through construction for transportation. Okay, great. Thank you very much. Those are some interesting insights that I think help inform this discussion. So next slide, please. So again, what we're going to do today is talk about the concept of addressing some of the uncertainty that COVID has brought forth in developing our transportation investment plans and strategies. And then talk about a couple of case studies from our experiences at EBP that kind of help inform how to address uncertainty, and then give you some observations and conclusions. So let's first talk about the relationship of transportation investment to economic and societal change at sort of a broad level. So when we think about transportation investment in projects, we usually think first of direct benefits to travelers, to system users. But there are also usually wider transportation benefits as well, such as improved reliability and connectivity. And then with a more reliable and well-connected transportation system, we also tend to see, effects on productivity through improved transportation efficiency, enhanced technology, and agglomeration of various economic activities. Taken together, all of these transportation user and system benefits usually lead to economic impacts at a broad level, including industrial output, increased employment and wages, and GDP growth. Next slide. So, where do these impacts and benefits come from? Well, when we invest in the transportation system, whether, in individual projects or management and operations, we set in motion a complex and interconnected series of effects on travel behavior and access, land development, business operations, and more, all of which affect us at a national level, at a regional level, at an urban level. And this complex system has many policy and investment levers, as I call them, that can be pulled, each of which may have numerous direct and indirect effects that also may drive their own impacts. For example, investments in improving access to public transport may improve the social and economic status of certain populations because their access to jobs and services is now enhanced. So generally, by using the range of methods and models and tools we've developed as an industry over the decades, we've been able to address much of this uncertainty that comes into the planning process within such a complex system. Next slide, please. But suddenly, we've had COVID drop on top of all our assumptions and plans. And we basically moved back somewhat to an era of real uncertainty regarding the future of transportation demand and needs. And now, as you've heard other speakers say, we're talking about, asking questions like, will people return to their offices? When will they do that? How many will do that? How reliable are supply chains? Are firms bringing, offshored industries and factories back home? And will people still ride public transport, in the way they used to, even after the pandemic ends and most people are vaccinated? So there are, a lot of questions that are now becoming important as this post-COVID uncertainty becomes real. So how can we plan for future transportation investment in such an uncertain time? Next slide. Well, we can start by thinking about what we can control and what we cannot control. We can generally control, or at least have a pretty good idea of our investment, our transportation investment goals and the benefits we want to achieve. We also generally know, or at least again, have a pretty good idea of the funding available and how we do or want to allocate those. But now, we have this sort of uncontrollable or somewhat unknowable dynamics. COVID's prevalence in our society generally as an illness, and COVID's somewhat direct impacts on society, on the economy, and on behavior. Those are things that we don't really have a lot of control over. But we can also, at the same time, clarify what we want to achieve through transportation investment. What are the benefits that we really care about? Is it industrial growth? Is it communities and livability? Is it decarbonization of transportation? Is it access to jobs or economic activity, or a lot of other things? And none of these are mutually exclusive either necessarily. Next. So if we think about these things and understand them, this can help us establish a framework for addressing the uncertainty surrounding the post-COVID world. And there are really two main aspects or elements to this. One is identifying and understanding what I'll call the observable impacts of COVID on the transportation system and personal and business travel behavior. Second is using such insights to support and inform scenario planning that allows us to mitigate future uncertainty and maximize the chances of achieving our desired transportation-related benefits that we've already articulated. The case studies that Frank Bruns and I will present in a moment we'll provide some examples and insights on how each of these elements can help us make more confident future investment plans and strategies. But before we move on, we have another audience poll question. So as we think about, what you want to achieve from transportation investment in the post-COVID world, what kind of benefits, what are the benefits that you regularly consider when evaluating transportation projects? And you can pick one or more of the options that we've given you here, and we recognize that these are not necessarily everything you might consider. Let's just give this a minute. Be interesting to see what folks say. Okay, I see safety is an important one. Life cycle costs, yes. Access and connectivity. Time savings. Yeah, safety and access and connectivity and life cycle costs, time savings. And I see economic growth benefits is also among the more frequently selected here. And I think one of the interesting aspects of this question and how we think about it is, obviously, as I said earlier, this is a complex system of impacts and benefits. And so a lot of these areas are obviously not mutually exclusive. There are lots of interconnections about them. And as we talk about scenario planning, we can see how we can take account of those interconnections and complex dynamics in planning. So, okay, thank you, Matt. Let me now turn it over to my colleague from EBP Switzerland, Frank Bruns.
Yes, hello together. Thank you very much, Peter, for these statements. I am happy to be here and to bring you some thoughts and analysis from Switzerland. And yeah, I think it's good that you answered in the third Mentimeter that a depth of changing travel demand is important for you, because I would like to focus on questions how COVID changed transportation demand in the moment and what will remain in a post-COVID world. And then I will start with my personal conclusion for public expenditures in transportation in future. Next slide, thank you. In Switzerland, we had now we are in a lucky position because there are two sources who on effects on transportation demand. One is of the ETH Zurich and another one of the Swiss National COVID-19 Science Task Force. Both of them work with handy tracking data of volunteers for since beginning of last year, and especially the ETH Zurich research work had been done also in September 2019 to January 2020. So this is a good range from to compare mobility behavior in COVID times and before COVID times. We have a number of volunteers here. For the moment, it's about 1,000 people from the ETH Zurich sample and 2,500 volunteers from the Swiss National COVID Task Force. This is for a population of 8 million people in Switzerland, a good sample to get representative results. Next slide, please. Switzerland, and when we look into the data later on, then we have to be aware that Switzerland has moderate restriction compared to other countries. The corona The US government response tracker of the University of Oxford compares these restrictions in different countries. You see this in this slide, and Switzerland is in this slide a red line, which is mainly below other ones. Just Finland has more moderate restrictions than Switzerland overall these times. But of all, also in Switzerland, public events, assemblies are forbidden. Theaters, museums, shops, and restaurants had been closed. Schools had been closed. Then they opened, and then they had been closed again. We have a duty to work at home if possible, and limitation of number of persons for family meetings. But compared to other countries, we have no bans on going out, for example. Next slide, please. What you see here is the reduction of mobile days from the people participating in this tracking system. And this tracking system, from 100% before pre-COVID time, it had been reduced to 80%. What means mobile days? Mobile days is just to go out when you leave your home. And this had been reduced with the first lockdown in March 2020 and was then going increase again after in the summer when there had been a post-lockdown time beginning. But it never comes back to the same status than before. But of course, there are people who are still working from home, persons furloughed and or newly unemployed. And of course, there are still existing restrictions concerning public events. So that it's not astonishing that the number of days where people go out is reduced to pre-COVID times. Next slide, please. What you see here is the daily trip distance in Switzerland, and over the last 15 months, which distance did people travel in the sample? And the average in Switzerland is 40 kilometers per day. Approximately with the lockdown, it was reduced, of course, but then the restrictions were getting more moderate, and even in summer, still with restrictions on public events and no assemblies. We had come back onto the same level as before, and now with the second wave of Corona and new restriction, it is reduced again. So we see people really react, and we see it in the data, and we see a fast recreation when we see it overall for the sample. How does it look like for the trip distance by mode, which is on the next slide, please? When you see it, have a look at the transport modes, then you can see here the black line for cars, the blue line for public transportation, red for pedestrians, and the gray others. And what you can see, and what is not really astonishing, is that pedestrians, of course, in the lockdown, it also was reduced, but later on, it was still on the same, stands still on the same level. Cars and motorcycle, they, in summer last year, even with restrictions, the daily trips became higher than before, but this can be explained by summertime compared to wintertime to January in the beginning of this time of the measurement of the people. But what is really a problem in Switzerland is the public transportation. With the lockdown, transportation demand was reduced by 90%. We heard this before also for America. It came back a little bit into the summer, but it never come back to the same level than before. And even now it has 40 to 60% less demand than in normal years. One reason for that might be that in Switzerland, since July the 6th, a mask requirement is introduced for using public transportation. But already half a month before, there was no increasing demand anymore on public transportation, so it stopped already before that. And so it might not be the full explanation for that people do not use public transportation in the same way as it did before. What is astonishing is, or surprised many people in Switzerland, it's shown here. You see the change in trips per mode for bicycle, bus, car, tram, train, and walking. And using bicycle really increased. And people shifted away from the large vehicles, as I explained before, from trams and trains, and come to car again, which totally recovered, even with restrictions up to now. And yeah, and the bicycles, they really get a run. And yeah, no one expected that really. But on the next slide, you can see one explanation in the first moment was that, yeah, with the lockdown, people were not really able to know what they do in the leisure time, and they bought bicycles for leisure time. And so it increased using bicycles in leisure time, but also when they had it, they used it also for working, for going working and shopping. And so we have a great rise in bicycle usage. Then we can go on the next slide, what effect has it on the road? I mentioned already that transport demand and traveling with cars totally recovered. And even when we see this slide here, which shows 1 day, all hours per day, and the speed with which these people traveled on separate distances, traveling distances, you see that here that the travel speed is still again the same in the post-lockdown phase than in the pre-lockdown phase. So ETH Zurich explains it and says, yeah, we have the same problems with congestions as before, even, of course, still reminding with restrictions in this actual phase now. So there's a huge transport demand existing. Next slide. So what can we see? What can we learn now for the moment? Walking and car return to pre-COVID values again. Bicycling a great winner for all trip purposes, not only for leisure time, also for going to work. Public transportation lost, and what we see in the data and from the people concerning working from home, this reduces trips of the people. They stay at home, but the mileage is not reduced because when they go out, they travel for, they make longer traveling. So transportation demand in peak hours is reduced, but not transport demand in mileages. So this is a result which fits to early telecommuting experiments even from the 1990s. Okay, what might remain of this change in travel behavior, which we see on the next slide? Please, next slide. Of course, a change in transportation demand had some reasons like ban of sports and cultural events. And I say, no, this will not be part of a post-COVID world. And also restrictions on restaurants, shops, number of guests and families, etc. I think this is not part of the future too. And also home teaching in Switzerland will not be an alternative for a longer while because of the social learning of people in schools, in groups, so that I hope that it will not be part of a postponed program, but will still remain home office and video conferences, but not in a smaller scope. And I hope furloughed persons and unemployed persons might be just a problem for a short time. So when I make my hypothesis of consequences for public transport investments on the next slide, then I have to say, yeah, the individual transportation modes might be the winners. Public transportation suffer for a longer while. People will not come back so fast to public transportation because of social distancing, because of home office, and video conferences. As mentioned before, of a speaker, that especially in public transportation, business people in Switzerland are on their ways, and so they might change their behavior. Bicycle is a winner on the agenda. Public investments in the infrastructure of bicycles have a further argument. It's a hype on investments in bicycle infrastructure because of climate change policy and spatial efficiency. But here we will see, even with this post-COVID times, that bicycle will get a greater part of the transport demand. Streets, yeah, at the moment we have congestions again. It's back even now and might increase in post-COVID times, but due to climate change policies, streets will not be built to transport demand, and so there will be this congestions in futures, and we have to think about mobility pricing, etc., to reduce these congestions. Public transportation here, it should be really thought about important investments in public transportation, which were decided to increase capacity for commuters with working from home and with all the video conferences. These investments should be evaluated again, even when transportation demands increase a little bit again. So you see, we cannot see all uncertainty and solve it, but we can, from the data, see what might be useful for our next steps. And Peter, you're going in a second case study where you explain more about these.
Yes, thank you very much, Frank. I think that was a great overview and some insights on changes in travel behavior and patterns based on, real world data and observation. In our second case study, we're focusing on Michigan here in the US, one of the larger states in the American northern part of the Midwest, borders Canada. Largest city, Detroit, and a variety of other smaller urban areas scattered throughout, and then it becomes very rural and almost wilderness in parts as you go farther north. It's obviously on the Great Lakes of the US. It actually touches 3 of the Great Lakes. So we are part of a team that is working on the statewide long-range transportation plan known as Michigan Mobility 2045. And what I'm going to talk about here is how scenario planning is being used for that plan. So I'm going to give you an example of a scenario planning process, including the effects of COVID on transportation demand, what might remain in the post-COVID world to consider, and how that is affecting thinking about public investment and expenditures in transportation. Next slide. So very briefly, this is a approach that involves both technical and qualitative scenario planning. And, in this graphic, you can see very generally how we used a combination of real world data, models and forecasts, and stakeholder input to conduct the process. Next slide. 4 global, quote unquote, scenarios were identified working with the state and stakeholders as a starting point for the analysis. And each of these scenarios had some combination of either slow or rapid economic development and either slow or rapid technological adoption, all thinking about going out to the year 2045. And, as I mentioned, the quantitative aspects of the process included a pretty large range of data sources and inputs. Next slide. Now, interestingly, COVID kind of set in just as we were starting the scenario analysis process. And so obviously, it both made things a little more complicated, but at the same time, we couldn't, really ignore COVID, and especially as it really set in the US and Michigan. So we needed to consider whether and how the world might change post-COVID from what we had been assuming it would be. Now, among the key items we looked at was employment growth in Michigan. The University of Michigan has a research center that is well known nationally and probably internationally for its population and demographic research and forecasting. So being in Michigan, we used the university's quantitative modeling and forecasts. And at the time we started versus the time we started looking at it post, or as COVID really set in, you can see that their forecast showed a drop in the number of future jobs from what was previously assumed. And going out to 2045, so what this shows is even well after COVID has receded, the expert quantitative forecasts are suggesting that there will be fewer jobs overall in terms of the new jobs along with natural economic and population growth. Next slide. So building on this and keeping in mind that a key aspect of scenario analysis is combining, objective quantitative data and modeling with more qualitative inputs and insights from experts and stakeholders. We went to the stakeholders involved in this process and asked them to provide their own opinions on how the state's employment might change over time in different scenarios. This is an important process, by the way, the stakeholder engagement, because it really helps build more support for the results of a plan and builds support for its implementation over time. So the effect of the COVID impacts and recession helped bound these questions that we asked in the scenario analysis process. Next slide. And as you can see, the stakeholders wanted to test a more pessimistic worst case scenario for employment than the data-driven model did. And they collectively are thinking that Michigan would have nearly 4% fewer jobs in the worst case scenario, which is about double the loss that the University of Michigan forecast said from its quantitative modeling. So let's stop here for another audience question. I'm curious to learn what you think might be the downside risk to your own economy from COVID over the next 15 or so years, out to 2035, compared to your existing forecasts. Will it be no change? Will it be 10% fewer, 5% fewer? Okay, so it's what I'm seeing here is kind of starting to reflect what the stakeholders in Michigan said as well, right around 4% or so. So that's interesting, that's useful, maybe not surprising. That as we've all been thinking about this and studying it over the last year or so, we're starting to sort of come to some consensus that we're looking at a long-term decrease in the growth of jobs across the economies. So, okay, thank you. Next slide. So another aspect of the scenario analysis process involved the geography or location of future growth in Michigan. So we're thinking about population, we're thinking about jobs. Where are these things going to happen? Where are they going to change? And of course, this is very important to understand because where growth occurs has major implications for where, how, and when we invest in transportation. Next slide. So again, we went to the stakeholders for their insights and opinions. And this was done in a workshop where each of the four, quote, alternative future scenarios was discussed and debated. And here on the screen, you can see an example of one result where the stakeholders actually see less future growth in suburban areas than the initial assumptions set, and more future growth in small cities and rural areas. So again, there's this objective quantitative analysis paired with or blended with the more subjective qualitative input from the stakeholders. Next slide. So, thinking about these spatial patterns, this is an interesting result because spatial patterns could be even more important to consider going forward. Both businesses and residential choices could change in ways that are decoupled from commuting. And all three areas, residential preferences, business location, changes in commute patterns, in varying combinations could really affect where and how we need to make investments. Next slide. And of course, one of the most recognized trends is e-commerce activity. And this graph shows e-commerce's share of retail sales in the US over the last 20 years and how rapidly it has grown, and in the COVID era as well. And we've seen this around the world. In some places, it's accelerated much more quickly. Next slide. Regardless of how large the impact of COVID ends up being, it's important to consider whether existing planning tools consider these types of long-term dynamics at all. And frankly, most do not. For example, digitization of services and retail could really fundamentally alter travel patterns over the next 25 years. The next slide shows a question we asked the Michigan stakeholders, so the response to that. And most Michigan stakeholders expected there to be a very significant increase in e-commerce shares of total retail sales over the next 30 years. They said perhaps 30% of all retail sales, but it's interesting to note that that's only where Great Britain already is right now. and far less than the e-commerce share in China today. So, how realistic is that? So one more question here, or actually the second to last question for you. Over the next 15 years in your market, how much greater do you think the e-commerce share of purchases and delivered to homes or offices will be compared to today? Will it be the same? Will it be 10 times as large? Will it be 5 times as large? Let's just take a minute to respond to this. So it looks like we're sort of converging on somewhere around 3 or 4 times as large as today, which is still very significant, obviously. So, okay, thank you. Next slide, please. While we don't have time today to discuss other elements of what we did in Michigan, I did want to note that we also address various other uncertain variables beyond just e-commerce, things like connected and automated vehicles, telecommuting, and more. And I think it's worth noting that scenarios like we used in Michigan can also be applied widely to things like corridor studies and even project level analyses. Next slide. And there are different ways to frame scenario analyses. For instance, the kind of scenario modeling we did for Michigan was reported in terms of aggregate changes in basic transportation performance. But it's also possible to look at how scenarios could affect specific corridors and routes. So, next slide, thank you. So using scenario analysis in Michigan is helping the state more fully understand, the nature and probabilities of several different alternative futures. And, what we've seen this do for the state is allow them to assess where, how, and when it makes transportation investments in terms of economic impacts and societal benefits. A key part of the value of the process in Michigan is that they will have a better chance of choosing projects that maximize positive results for the state. So one more audience poll question. As I've described, stakeholders from across Michigan's business, government, and institutions were engaged in this process on a continuing basis. And I've talked about how that's so important for buy-in and progress going forward. Who do you see as the most important stakeholders for a similar process, in your situation? There's a few suggested answers up there.
And Peter, as you're getting these answers, I can give you about another minute and then we have to wrap up.
I'm moving to the last slide after this, thanks. So it looks like the consensus is zeroing in on other levels of government, which I assume probably includes elected officials and policymakers, as well as people within the transportation planning agency. Great, thank you. So let me conclude with a few observations and thoughts here. As I mentioned earlier, transport investments are obviously mostly in our control, but I think it's fair to say that significant uncertainty is going to remain post-COVID for quite some time to come, many years probably. And some of COVID's impacts on transportation demand and behavior are probably essentially permanent, while wider effects may need many years to play out. We won't exactly know what's going to be. I think that decision makers may consider significant what we call right sizing options to align investments more cost effectively with identified or predicted future transportation demand. And I think future-proofing plans means considering how these different alternative futures affect the probability of achieving the goals and wider economic benefits we want to achieve. And this goes beyond some of our traditional tools such as benefit cost analysis. And scenario planning, as we've done in Michigan and elsewhere, if it uses sound data and the right input, it can produce insights that really help minimize the impacts of uncertainty on investment decisions and gives us more confidence going forward. So with that, I'd like to thank Frank for being part of this, and I'll turn it back to you, Tim.
Peter, thanks. Thank you, Frank, for a really excellent presentation. Let me do a quick time check as Bing is looking at the chat box and questions, and let folks know that we are about 15 minutes behind. I apologize to the future speakers that you will be starting a little bit late in hopes that you'll be able to accommodate that change. Please continue to use the time allotments that was given to you for those remaining presentations as you think ahead. Bing, we had a number of questions in the chat box. Please take the floor and help us with those Q&A.
Thanks, team. Now we have questions that's coming related to the first topic as well as related to the second topic. Let me start with the latest conversation we have. We have one comment from Swanyam Panda regarding Frank's comments, Frank's presentation. As more people travel for leisure and no work-related trips, how this is going to change road users' expectation from road infrastructure, facilities, and the safety concerns.
Don't know if I have a good answer by my hand. I think in leisure times, people are going out of the peak hours. That's a good thing for safety and for the investments, because it's out of, it's not on capacity restraints bidden. What effect this has on security or safety, it's quite difficult to say, because it depends where they are going, on which streets they are going. Often in leisure times, you are going in valleys or something like that, where the streets are not so secure as a national highway or something like that, which you more use for commuting. So you have to figure out. I hope this answers the question a little bit.
Great. Thanks, Frank. Next, we have two big questions that I think are very important, which I think merit additional a couple more minutes discussion. So first one is raised by Patrick for Lincoln, Flor, regarding the investment in road infrastructure impact in job creation. But at the same time, many policies aim at reducing the impact of transport on climate change. Are there ways to reconcile the two? Do you discuss this on the work stage? And Matt Hardy also has additional comments, said in the US, we also focus on alternatives on more road building. Is it better to, for new roads and reduce the greenhouse gas? How do we reconcile these two policy objectives? Lincoln, can you respond quickly?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, during this big debate with COVID, many governments are trying to reorient and reallocate resources in the way to generate employment. No? I mentioned, for example, rural roads that are in developing countries are one of the priorities to connect production with markets and also to access to jobs, access to health services and education. So that's one of the key priorities. And the second line is for highways or corridors that connects major cities and ports and logistics for the country. Climate change is completely important in all these projects. Is one of our corporate commitments that we have in the banking with our clients. Our environmental and social standards are high, but we see that in these months are very difficult to implement projects with high standards because there is too much speed in the government, and sometimes there is some kind of risk in the implementation. Also, all the institutional arrangement in the governments sometimes is weak, and the people with climate change skills are only few, and this makes a little bit more difficult to implement projects that will support this priority. So some other countries are making very good efforts, like for example, Colombia is one of the leader countries in the region that are implementing a very good climate change agenda linked to the transport sector, and they have working together between the Ministry of Energy, the Ministry of Transport, and the cities, trying to set up and align all the climate change policies with the transport investments. And there are a set of incentives for these investments, and the justification in the economic analysis needs to be very robust to justify why public investment should support projects that are creating value, improving the environment. And because, if we do roads only for do roads, sometimes we are supporting private travels that is not good for congestion and also for climate change. And second, maybe we are not allocating the resources in the right sector. So there is a big debate in the region. There are many instruments that has been implemented in the last months, trying to reorient the limited resources that developing countries have in this context. We are still monitoring, but we see that some countries are doing a great job. Thank you.
Thanks. The next important question was raised by Joe Bruns regarding sustainability. He asked, do you think COVID-19 provide us an opportunity to shift the paradigm to develop a more sustainable society? Is it possible some aspects of sustainable transportation policy could or even should we be accelerating? We received comments, very long comments from team, and Matt also chimed in regarding the impact on public transportation. And Patrick also had some comments. I would like to ask them to express their thinking. Tim, we'll start with you. Please keep your comments brief.
Thanks, Bing. And I'd really like to put this to Peter and Frank because of their experience in the world of economic analysis. I've posted in the chat box my question that is really related to that, because we on the PIARC Tech 1.2 committee are really trying to understand how we approach this new normal and what methods, tools, techniques might be available to us as we continue to think about and help the world understand how they might approach this issue. So Peter, if you could just weigh in on how we start to deal with those wider area economic impacts, societal changes, that new normal when it comes to equity issues, et cetera, I'd appreciate it.
Sure. Yeah, I think this is really going to become much more prominent an issue than perhaps it's been in transportation in at least a generation, if not longer. I mean, what COVID has done in the US at least is really articulated and amplified the lack of access and lack of equitable mobility options across different social and economic strata. We have developed and worked on various research projects and continue to do so. For example, we are working on a transportation research board project right now that has to do with transit access and options in rural areas where much of our poverty and disadvantaged population lives in the US. And we also not long ago did a project under FHWA for the state of Arizona and its metropolitan planning organizations. We developed a tool called the Value Impact Assessment, or VIA tool, which essentially is a modeling tool and approach that allows planners and decision makers to understand the wider economic impacts and benefits of transportation benefits at a large geographic level. And as, for example, you could assess the impact on access to economic opportunity and jobs, supply chain impacts, and so forth of a new highway interchange or transit service in one part of a mega region on the entire mega region, and figure out if commuting opportunities or job access opportunities change between one part of the region and another, for example. So I know we don't have much time today, but there are tools being developed out there that, and I would suggest one relatively straightforward way to take a look at some of the most current research that I'm aware of is to look at the NCHRP and TCRP websites, with TRB, because that's where I think a lot of this most current research is going on. And in fact, TRB just the other day issued an updated list of pending research projects. And I think there were several sort of equity and access research topics or projects among them. So this is, really, I think, coming to the fore in a big way. And I think the new administration, Biden and Secretary Buttigieg, are viewing this as a very high priority here in the States.
Great, thank you, Peter. I will just read comments from Patrick and Anna. Patrick agreed equity is becoming a major issue, and he suggests it would be interesting to explore case studies where public transportation offer has been reduced, while at the same time cycling lanes put in place in a rush. It would be nice to see what's the impact. Additionally, Anna Gog shared a link about her earlier presentation regarding COVID-19 and the crash pattern. You can find it in the chat box. Now I give the floor back to Tim.
Thank you, Bing. And thank you, Peter and Frank, again for that excellent presentation. And thanks to all participants for your questions. Time is running short, but also I want to acknowledge that we will be going long. as I want to honor the content of this webinar. So we will move into topic 3, which we've titled Case Studies and Perspectives Predicting the Post-COVID-19 Implications on Economic Development. As I stated at the beginning of this webinar, all of us in the transportation industry will continue to be challenged to consider the role of transportation in this evolving new normal that includes differing views on personal, economic, and societal priorities. As we collectively move from COVID response to this new world of COVID recovery, we must consider and we must predict what transportation infrastructure will be needed to meet the transportation demand, supply, and performance well into the future. I believe it's really possible and necessary for transportation planners to answer these questions. And I also believe that the post-COVID recovery approaches to planning transportation systems and investments has to be reevaluated and really needs to be transformed. As such, the remaining 2 presenters offer today examples that are really intended to inform your understanding of and assist planning for post-COVID recovery, including tools, methods, and processes for evaluating and communicating a wide spectrum of possible paths to assess, to address, and to manage the economic and social needs and the impacts of that post-COVID world. We will likely go 20 to 30 minutes long on this webinar to honor our remaining presenters. Please plan for that. I apologize to those that may have to leave because of your own time constraints. Let me give the podium next to Joe Mahon. He will introduce himself, his affiliation, and his title for this particular presentation. Welcome, Joe.
Thanks, Tim. And so as not to exclude any of the many time zones represented today, I'll just start by saying good hello to everyone out there and how honored I am to present before this global audience today, a very different audience from the sorts that I normally present to in my corner of the United States. My name is Joe Mahon. I'm a regional economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. I'll talk a little bit more about our region and the work I do briefly, but first, if you could advance to the next slide, Matt. A quick disclaimer, if I say anything stupid, it reflects poorly only upon me and not necessarily on the Federal Reserve Bank, my employer. If you could advance to the next slide. Oh, and apologies, these scroll. So if you can just scroll ahead the next few. So I'll be focusing today on, or this event, really on not as much the economy overall, but 2 particular sectors that we have some good indicators of the economic outlook for, and that are very heavy users of roads and other modes of transportation, really for all sizes of freight. And those are manufacturing and construction. I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that we do at the Federal Reserve in tracking the economy and how the pandemic presented some new challenges for that, and share some indicators, as I mentioned, of really the near-term outlook for these sectors. And I hope that'll be interesting to you. So this is a map here of the Federal Reserve System, just to give you a sense, especially for those internationally, of the region that I'll be talking about. So the Federal Reserve is America's central bank. We cover we set monetary policy and regulate banking institutions in the United States, and we're a decentralized central bank. So when the Federal Reserve was designed a little more than a century ago, the nation was divided up into 12 Federal Reserve districts, and at the Minneapolis Fed, we covered this north central portion of the United States. For those familiar with the geography of the American states, we cover the states of Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, and then portions of Wisconsin and Michigan, actually overlapping a little bit with some of the territory that Peter was covering earlier. So it's our job to keep track of what's happening in this part of the country, and I do a little bit of economic forecasting as well. And as you can imagine, that's been much more challenging over this last year. If you could advance to the next, actually 2 slides forward. So just to kind of put that in context, this is part of the reason this was challenging, especially during the early stages of the pandemic, is that the best macroeconomic data that we have to indicate how the economy is performing comes out with a really substantial lag. And this is especially true at a regional or state level in the United States. So I have here gross domestic product. That's kind of our best measure of the total output of an economy. And I have it plotted for the United States and Minnesota through the third quarter of 2020. And that's just to kind of underscore, that's the most recent data that we have for states. We have US GDP for the fourth quarter so far. Of course, we're at the end of the first quarter of 2021 now. So these come out with a very substantial lag, and even though it's the kind of best indicator we have of the overall economic activity, it's not timely when things are changing as rapidly as they were. And of course, you can see here the tremendous drop in GDP during the second quarter, during that lockdown phase of the pandemic, and really record growth actually during the third quarter. But that's a little bit illusory because that growth was off of an extremely low level. So if you put it in terms of kind of indexing it to its previous level, you can see that as of the third quarter, we still had quite a bit of room for recovery. If you could move to the next slide, I'll show you a little bit more recent data for employment. Similar pattern, really stark drop in employment during that early phase during March, April of last year, and it's recovered, but still well below where it was both regionally and nationally prior to the pandemic. And this is for the purposes that I think that this audience is interested in, which has to do with transportation usage. This is a more relevant metric than the more commonly referenced metric of the labor market that you'll see on the next slide, which is unemployment. The unemployment rate has come down quite rapidly relative to historical experience during recessions, but that's a little bit illusory because the unemployment rate really only measures those who are out of work but seeking work, so those who are in the labor force. It doesn't count all of the people who are out of the labor force. And so if you look at it just in terms of the total number of people employed, we still are quite far from our peak and have quite a ways to go. But again, these data now are all a couple months out of date. So if you can move to the next, actually 2 slides ahead. We have a couple different sources that we've turned to kind of remedy some of these shortfalls in the data. And one of the best tools that we have are our surveys of businesses. So as I'm going to share results of 2 surveys, I'll walk through them very quickly in the interest of time. But as I mentioned, 2 sectors that I think are pretty key to the transportation picture, and in particular freight transportation on roads, and those are manufacturing and construction. I think that these are pretty interesting to look at, especially over the last year, because these are both sectors that, compared to other sectors of our economy, were relatively less affected by the pandemic, at least in our region of the country. Minnesota and Wisconsin, states that put lockdowns into place. These industries were, generally speaking, considered essential and weren't as heavily disrupted as certainly some other industries such as restaurants and hospitality. And yet, if you would move to the next slide, we still saw significant contraction in manufacturing. So this is, again, aggregating the results of a survey that we conducted in December and January. It's actually a scientific survey. We took a random sample of manufacturers of all sizes in our region. It was stratified by firm size and by state. And what you can see here is just kind of an aggregation of these results in a diffusion index. So anything to the right of that solid black line at 50 there indicates that on average, the respondents told us that these indicators were contracting. Anything to the left would be, or I'm sorry, anything to the left indicates contraction, and anything to the right above a value above 50 indicates expansion. And I think for the audience today, those top 3 are really the key indicators you're going to be looking at. So the orders, that's sort of a measure of demand that these manufacturers are reporting to us, production, the level of output, and employment, of course, the number of people commuting to work. And so what's interesting is, even though compared to some of our other sectors, manufacturers were relatively less affected, on average, they did report to us that 2020 was a down year. A lot of variability, though, in the respondents, some reporting actually record years, a lot of kind of mixed picture over the course of the year. And a lot of this wasn't due necessarily, again, to the lockdown, because most of these facilities were classified as essential, but due to production slowdowns either at suppliers or at their customers. As you might be aware, the American auto manufacturers idled plants earlier in the pandemic just to slow the spread of the disease, and that had a large spillover effect. If you could move to the next slide, just to kind of put these in context. So these are, again, those top 3 metrics that I think are most relevant to those in the audience today. Just to kind of put it in context of where the survey results fell this year compared to history. And these are the worst results we've seen in more than a decade, really going back to the Great Recession. And again, keeping in mind that manufacturing fared somewhat better than a lot of the other sectors that we track in our economy. More interesting for our purposes today is the outlook, which if you move to the next slide, Matt, you'll see our aggregation, as I just showed you, in a diffusion index, but this is for the outlook that these manufacturers had for 2021. So in spite of the contraction that they saw in the previous year, for a gamut of economic indicators, and in particular for demand or orders, for output or production, and for employment, they're expecting increases, and the majority of firms expecting large increases in 2021. The one other item that, and this is something that I'll be kind of hitting at a little bit more, that I want to draw your attention to in the middle of this chart are prices, both for input prices and the prices that these manufacturers are charging for their products. That was the only thing among these indicators that they reported to increase in 2020, and the outlook is for more increases in 2021. And if there's any takeaway from my comments today, I think it's going to be really not really a question that I'm not really going to answer, which is, what is the role of our transportation infrastructure in some of the supply chain constraints that we've seen pop over the last year, and how can you as transportation planners think about that in the work that you have ahead of you? If you move to the next slide, just to kind of put this sort of index of their outlook in context of recent history, you can see that this is kind of consistent with a typical year. So going back to 2020, of course, we conducted this survey before the pandemic had really spread outside of China, and expectations for 2020 were pretty positive. So take this with a grain of salt. But the expectations for the coming year are about consistent with what we've seen in recent years, which have all been, at least for the manufacturers in our region, pretty strong growth years. Moving ahead to the next slide. We also asked them about their overall economic expectations. So what I was showing you so far was just their outlook for their own firms. But we also asked them about their outlook for the national and state economies. And again, you can see their outlook for 2021 is positive for the coming year. But in particular, you can see that the category that they have slated for the fastest rate of expansion is going to be inflation, because again, over and over again, these contacts are telling us that they're seeing really tremendous pressure on some of their input prices, partly due to the supply constraints. A lot of comments received along with these surveys about expanded lead times and disruptions in the supply chain over the last year. And again, I think most of those really, if you drill down into them, are due to production disruption or disruptions at the production level. That is to say, at supplying firms internationally or domestically in the United States, difficulties obtaining raw materials, which have been reflected in increases in prices for metals, plastics, and a lot of other raw material inputs. But some of this is quite likely a result of bottlenecks in our transportation infrastructure as well. And I think that's just kind of an open question, sort of how important of an impact that is, and what the implications are for the future growth. So if you move, just a couple other things that I want to share with you from this survey before I move on to the next one. And turn to manufacturing. We asked specifically some special questions about the pandemic impacts. If you could move to the next slide, please, Matt. So again, getting back to that theme I was just highlighting, The most significant impact reported by these manufacturers, of the ones that we asked them about, was delays in their supply chain. You can see more than 3/4 of the respondents reported an increase in delays in their supply chains, and this is really the biggest, the most significant result that we got in this portion on this question. Along with a majority of firms reporting to, a near majority of firms reporting to us that they saw a negative impact on productivity. And those two things are most likely related. Of course, productivity also negatively impacted by outbreaks among workers at some facilities, by the requirement to maintain social distance and provide personal protective equipment. Those are all things that we heard about as well. But certainly those supply chain delays having a major impact on these producers. And the last thing I'll turn to on the next slide, just in terms of kind of the near-term outlook. And again, keeping in mind that these businesses generally were that these manufacturers were generally more optimistic for the coming year than a lot of other firms that we've been hearing from in other survey work that we do. And yet still just about half of them were expecting at the end of 2020 and early 2021, when we conducted this survey, about half of them were expecting that it would take more than 6 months before their business returned to normal. About 15% telling us 4 to 6 months. And 20% saying that they haven't seen that much effect on their business at all. So again, you can kind of see quite a bit of diversity in the responses on this particular question. I'm going to move ahead now to the next, actually 2 slides ahead, and talk about the construction. You can actually skip through this whole slide if you don't mind, Matt, and go to the next one here. So construction is another sort of interesting industry to highlight, again, because they were largely unaffected during the early phase of the pandemic. And in fact, residential construction, as I'll show you in a moment, building of houses was actually substantially has remained really strong through this period. And so the early phase of the pandemic was actually not that disruptive to these firms. However, we're starting to see some indications of a slowdown, more so than the normal winter slowdown that we see during this part of the year. But some near-term indications of some improvement. And I'll walk through these very quickly. I'm probably going to skip a lot of these slides in the interest of time. But if you would move ahead to the next slide, please. So just to kind of give a brief indication of where we are right now, as of February, when we conducted this survey, the recent trend in revenue has turned down. Majority of firms reporting that revenues now are somewhat lower than they were a year ago. And about half of them reporting that they're lower than they were in the prior quarter to this one. Expectations slightly more positive for the coming 3 months, which again suggests maybe some indication of a turnaround. If you could move to the next slide, just a little bit on the geographic kind of variation of this. I glossed over really quickly our region of the country that we cover. Minneapolis, St. Paul is really the largest metropolitan area in this region, the only really major metropolitan area on a national level in our region of the country. Much of our region is rural and not as densely populated. About half of the respondents in this survey did come from the Minneapolis-St. Paul metropolitan area. So when you compare them to the other respondents for the remainder of greater Minnesota and the other states in our region, you can see that the picture, the revenue picture, is slightly more positive in the outlying parts of our region outside of the metro area. If you want to look at it by category of construction, again, you can see the biggest decrease in revenue has been for commercial or non-residential construction. Better picture for residential or housing construction. Infrastructure and heavy construction, I think probably of most interest to this room, is in between those two. Kind of a mixed bag. I'm going to skip ahead through the next few slides here. Let's skip this one and move to just a real quick overview of project cancellations. We've had a increased in the number of cancellations over the last year, particularly both in the among private projects and within industrial and infrastructure and non-residential. But that activity, the number of cancellations reported by these contacts has declined in the most recent survey relative. Again, kind of an indication of some turnaround in this activity. Getting into, if you advance to the next slide, actually one more ahead, just to kind of look ahead to the sort of near-term outlook. We've seen some improvement in requests for proposals. So it was kind of an interesting picture when we were doing these surveys earlier during the pandemic. We saw strong indicators of current activity. Builders, the contractors and other builders were staying pretty busy, but they were seeing a decline in the number of projects out for bid. What we see now is while revenue and some other indicators of activity have slowed down, there's been some improvement in requests for proposals or projects out for bid. And then actually in the Minneapolis, St. Paul area, they've turned net positive for the first time since the pandemic. And you can see these broken out here for public versus private projects. Again, green indicates increases, as in these other charts. Red indicates decreases on average among these survey participants. And if you move to the next slide, and I'll kind of close it out here with a kind of, or at least for construction, I'll kind of close it out here with the, again, strongest activity within residential and home building. The housing market nationally and also in our part of the country in the United States is still very strong. Interestingly, during this period, there's been a lot of activity in home renovation as well, probably related to more people sitting around at home looking at their houses thinking they could make improvements. But we've seen, again, some recovery in both the infrastructure and in the non-residential. How much of a role, turning to the infrastructure side, how much of a role some of the recent stimulus funds or the funds that were appropriated to state and local governments earlier in the pandemic may have played a role in this is an open question, and one I'd be interested in hearing the audience's thoughts on. So if you just move ahead one slide, I'll wrap up the results of this survey here. Just to kind of summarize and say that in construction, recently conditions turned more difficult, but there's some indication again that conditions are improving. And before I wrap up, I just want to move to show on our website, if you could move to the next 2 slides ahead, please. So I started out my comments by talking about the challenges that were presented to us in relying on a lot of the traditional economic data that we look at during the early phase of the pandemic. And so at the Minneapolis Fed, we've really ramped up our usage of maybe noisier but higher frequency data that we have. And one of the best sources of data that we have available to us are data that we can get from cell phone vendors. And so these come from Google, and we have, if you go to our website, we have a dashboard of a number of these higher frequency indicators of the impact of COVID. And I'm going to focus just on a few here for this audience that are focused on transportation. So this is from Google Community Reports. And it just tracks at a state level and for the United States traffic to workplaces. So places that users have identified as their work. You can see obviously it fell tremendously during the lockdown phase of the pandemic, and it's recovered somewhat, but still well below where it was a year ago, even in those parts of our districts such as South Dakota and North Dakota that have taken a more laissez-faire approach to imposing lockdowns. So a lot of this, of course, has to do with activity in the economy rather than restrictions imposed by governments. If you look at some of the other mobility indicators that we have, moving to the next slide, we have we also track travel to a number of other destinations, including retail and recreation. This one is interesting. Again, it follows the pattern that a lot of these charts that you've seen follow. I'll just draw your attention to the end of this chart here, which is to show some trend upward in travel to retail and recreation destinations during this period. And just kind of point out that over this period, if you look at some of these kind of indicators compared to case counts, they tend to move together. So we've seen an increase in travel recently to retail and recreation destinations, but we've also seen throughout the United States and in the states in our region an uptick in cases. And so it's sort of an open question whether we might see this level off and how much of this is going to be driven by the arrival of spring in our part of the country. I'm going to end just with a couple more charts here. Our partners, actually, Tim's colleagues at the Minnesota Department of Transportation have been great about providing really daily information to us on auto traffic. And you can see, again, consistent with some of the information that other presenters, Herr Bruns and Peter presented. The dramatic decline in use of transit that hasn't recovered in Minnesota. Heavy truck volume, again, consistent with some of the earlier data I was showing you from manufacturing, has held up better during this period. One last thing that I want to show you, just to kind of put a plug in if you're interested in some of this data. We have a lot more on our website, and I would encourage you to go to our website, minneapolisfed.org, and take a look at our COVID dashboard that we update on a regular basis with these real-time indicators. So with that, I'm going to end my comments, and I look forward to your questions. And again, thank you to Tim and to PIARC for inviting me here today to present. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe, for that excellent presentation. I'm going to move quickly to Dejan so that we can round out the presentations on this topic area and get to the Q&A part of this particular topic area. Welcome, Dejan. Please introduce yourself, your affiliation, and your subject matter for the day. Welcome.
Hi, can you hear me, Tim?
Very well, thank you.
Okay, thank you. After this voice check, I am Dejan Makovsek, and I am the procurement strategy lead at the Infrastructure and Procurement Division at the OECD. But very recently, I was still working for the International Transport Forum. And one of my last things was to deliver a brief or a report where the main focus was how should countries invest in a post-COVID era to get maximum bang for the buck or to stimulate the economic recovery. So I'll mainly be talking about that. I would like to thank you for your patience, and also note that perhaps one or two things you will hear again, since I'm the last in the row, and a lot of the wisdom was already shared before that by other presenters. Still, there'll be a lot of new stuff as well. So the first COVID response was about keeping the essential services running. And now the countries want to know how to jumpstart the economy after, hopefully, the current epidemic will come to an end. Now, the key constraint is, if you want to talk about economic recovery and jumpstarting the economy, it's something that needs to start relatively fast after an epidemic. That's somewhere between 3 to 5 years. So what can we do within 3 to 5 years? Can we ad hoc increase the volume of infrastructure investment? Or can we shift toward greener, more resilient, more equitable investments? And these names are captured by a hype called Building Back Better. And this is exactly what we'll be talking about. To what extent can we actually build back better? Next slide, please. So that infrastructure investment can boost growth is not controversial. If you look at the short-term cumulative multiplier of public investment, it has one of the highest multipliers among all types of spending. Means that for every dollar that we spend, we get $1.53 of economic activity. There's also a long-term impact, a contribution to productivity growth, but in this particular context of how to jumpstart the economy, it's less relevant. Next slide, please. Now, people have already been, let's say, collecting lessons from past crises, since this is not the first time we find ourselves in trouble and have to think about how to pick ourselves up after a difficult economic period. And what the IMF and some other institutions have come up with was that countries need to keep in mind three basic objectives. We should try to allocate investment to those places where we will get the highest benefits. We should at the same time be thinking about equity, and the stimulus should be fast and big enough. And they've also connected these objectives through more like TTT, through a TTT acronym, which sometimes overlaps with these ideas, in the sense that investment needs to be targeted, connects with efficiency and equity. They need to be timely, connects with effectiveness, and they need to be temporary. Increasing the volume of investment requires fiscal expansion, and fiscal expansion cannot be indefinite, meaning that countries cannot be spending more than they earn indefinite. So that's why all our spending needs to be fast enough, which is timely, but it also needs to be temporary. Next slide, please. So these were the broad objectives or lessons that countries have learned from past crises. But then there's a question of operational implications. How do we apply these objectives, and what kind of issues they create in the policies that countries would like to apply? So we have already heard something about changing patterns of demand from previous presenters. And a basic observation is that if we had projects appraised shortly before the crisis, and they concern large urban areas, we should probably reassess the assumptions of the benefits of these investment proposals. That the crisis may have accelerated the acceptability of teleworking is, of course, just one dimension, because people dealing with demand forecasting have been observing changes in behavioral patterns already before the crisis. There is a brief, of course, behind this, a report behind this presentation, and you can consult the details in the presentation itself. Next slide, please. Second thing is, if we really want to ramp up the procurement and start delivering new infrastructure, there's several things we need to keep in mind. On the public side, there are different capacities and capabilities to appraise projects and manage contracts at a central government level and at a regional government level. So usually where the greatest capabilities and capacity of a country to deliver is at the central government level, because that level has the most frequency in delivering major capital schemes. The same skills are much less developed on a regional government level. And if you want to increase the volume of investment, then you do also need to consider the regional government level. On the private sector, we have a construction sector that is subject to opposing forces. On one side, some countries have observed a reduction in economic activity in terms of construction, which you could say liberated some of the capacity of the construction sector to absorb new work. But on the other hand, especially in Europe, there's been a reduced mobility of workers due to travel restrictions, which on the other hand reduced the capacity of the construction sector. So it needs to be carefully weighed. How much can we invest to not overheat the local construction sector? Next slide. Some countries do like to talk about how to jumpstart the economy, but we also need to consider that some really interesting decarbonization measures are not actually capital intensive. Although there was some reports that traffic levels in some cases are slowly creeping back to normal, the reduction of car traffic in major urban areas created space for reallocation of road space. So there's been more and more cycling paths, more pedestrian space, and so forth. And this is much easier to do in a time period when there's reduced demand for road space. At the same time, these measures are not actually the ones that are capitally intensive and will not in a major way contribute to boosting economic growth, but they shouldn't be forgotten. Next slide. Can we build back better and keep to the timely, targeted, and temporary principles? The best projects that fit those objectives are maintenance projects with low preparation requirements. There is not really that much scope or close to nothing to reprioritize major pipelines in the short term. The planning horizon for infrastructure in transport, especially major capital projects, is above 5 years. Many projects actually take 10 years to prepare. And there's not really much that we could do on the short run without instilling moral hazard or other issues in the process. There is something we can do in terms of how projects are delivered. For example, having a plan to deliver some railway station and putting in more elevators for people that need assistance. But that's just the substance of the investment. It doesn't fundamentally change what you're trying to do. Fundamentally reallocating investments or choosing different projects and trying to fast track them is not really realistic if we're talking about a time span of 3 to 5 years. Next, please. So, but that doesn't mean that there haven't been some countries that have tried to cut some corners to speed up delivery of projects. In one particular case, a country has omitted the public consultation to try to speed up the planning and appraisal process of the project, but with that they expose themselves to risk of legal action and protest, which would then have a knock-on effect on keeping the timelines of the project or maybe cause cost overruns. It's important to understand that in advanced economies, which have evolved systems for public investment management, planning, appraisal, and everything that goes with it, it's not possible to create ad hoc acceleration, and process optimization takes time. Thank you. Next slide, please. Then you may have seen among the timely and temporary objectives that one thing was to allocate money to those investments which yield the best benefit to cost ratio. And the other objective in the same table was about equity. Now, these two objectives are obviously at odds. If you want to create a maximum yield through CBA, what you want to do is invest money where there already is a high density of economic activity, because that will give you greatest increment. However, if you want to improve, achieve the greatest relative improvement of a particular group of people, then that means you need to direct money somewhere outside of the centers of greatest economic activity. So that requires a political consensus. How much of that money should be spent to maximize the benefit cost analysis outputs, and how much should be spent on equity. The short-term fiscal multiplier would not change because the construction works and everything would still have the same impact or similar impact on the economic, the short-term economic activity. But it does have an impact in terms of who is affected or who benefits from these investments. And it does take quite a bit of time to actually reach a political consensus about who should benefit. Next slide. I already talked about the central and regional government capacities and capabilities, and like I said, a clear trade-off in that sense is that yes, we can more easily achieve the sufficient size criterion by spending or giving more money to regional authorities. But the downside is that there is empirical evidence that regional authorities are less capable in running major capital schemes, and then the efficiency of that investment, especially on the procurement side, might be in question. Next slide, please. So last question or last point is, we've seen that people are very much concerned about the funding, but there's still this confusion about the role of private investment. I'm sure that much of the audience is aware that PPPs are a procurement mechanism and they don't actually create new funding opportunities per se. The other thing is they take a lot of time to set up, and if you want to reach the timeliness objective, they really work against it. The general position of the ITF, and based on the research we've made at the time, is that if a state can borrow, it should. If you really want to fast track investment, the public financing route is the straightforward one. And next slide, please. And if you have any doubt about that, please consult our major body of work on that topic, with 1 synthesis report and 19 input reports. Before I conclude, right now in my new division, we are running a new pilot project on, we are testing a new tool, how to inform the procurement strategy of major capital projects on 2 roads in Norway. And in there, we are breaking new ground that goes beyond the question of just a delivery model, but also raises the issues about contract scoping and packaging. And what people often tend to forget is they quickly jump into the question, should it be a PPP, should it be traditional procurement? But they forget that the issue whether the whole project should be procured as one major contract or whether there should be several contracts, and where the boundaries between them should be, is a major question that predetermines to a large extent what the outcomes of procurement will be. So if you have any questions on that front, feel free also to reach me after this, this presentation. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you for that excellent last presentation of the day. It really is the icing on the cake to take us into the final Q&A. I did see a number of Q&A questions, chat box, Bing. Let's take about 10 minutes to walk through any questions that we have there.
Thanks. First, we have a question from Team Henkel that addressed to Joe. Is the scorecard a helpful tool to communicate the status of key economic performance?
Yeah, I think it's a useful heuristic tool, at least. Ultimately, we like to rely on the official economic statistics when they become available. I think what we found over the last year is that some of the higher frequency indicators that we put on like our dashboard are good predictors, at least in terms of direction. Although the direction of the impact on of the pandemic on the economy wasn't really in question at the outset of it. The magnitude, of course, is a different matter. We definitely saw those reflected in on some of our kind of scorecard metrics. And we saw improvement in those consistent with the improvement we've seen in the economy since then. But of course, it's the trade-off here is that these indicators are noisy and less accurate.
Thank you.
Thanks. Next, we have a question, actually, a similar question from both Patrick and the team regarding the analysis of decarbonization and the road space allocation versus equity. This is addressed to Dejan. Can you elaborate on this issue? For example, if we think of backlanes in urban areas, that answers the needs for decarbonization, but might not help with other users such as elderly or disabled or the delivery trucks.
Yes. So I have to say that on that particular area, I'm not an expert. You may be aware that the ITF runs a huge program of work, which is called the decarbonization of transport. And there, it includes a register of all the different measures that are possible to decarbonize transport. And one of those that pertain to policies, what can you do on a street level, is something that my former colleague, Tatiana Samsonova, has been publishing several reports on it. So I'd like to direct you to her. Right, go on Google, punch in ITF, decarbonization of transport, road space reallocation, and you should get plenty of hits. Sorry.
I don't have other questions. Do you want to open the floor, or we just move on since we're already behind schedule?
Let me see if anybody else has any follow-up questions that they'd like to pose verbally before we move on to the conclusion of the meeting. Going once, going twice. All right, let's move to the wrap up of this meeting. Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Dejan. Much appreciated for those excellent presentations. So to conclude today's meeting is difficult. What I mean by that is we covered a lot of territory in an extremely short period of time that covered the post-COVID recovery, and yet it covers many, many areas of need when it comes to how we approach post-COVID recovery. But as I sifted through the excellent presentations and the conclusions and the findings of those presentations, I found 6 or 7 items that I think are of note and important for us to capture as we conclude this very useful webinar. First and foremost, it's very clear that the pandemic has truly accelerated some of those key societal trends, and that those trends are directly affecting transportation economics and will definitely affect planning for a post-pandemic era. In all of the presentations, it became very clear that data and economic assumptions are critical to future considerations and planning for post-COVID recovery, and will be critical in our ability as planners and policymakers to ensure that the results and the decisions that are made are credible as we look at the pre and post impacts of the pandemic. In many of the presentations, we heard about social equity and the importance of looking at social equity, the acceleration of that consideration as we look at and consider priorities for transportation in the future that may or may not look different than what we see in the pre-COVID era. We are seeing some shifts in work at home patterns, and we're seeing the results of that being significant reductions in travel. Although we're seeing patterns returning, we are seeing still less congestion and the potential for us to perpetuate that as we look at options for decarbonization and equity well beyond this pandemic. Scenario planning that accounts for wider area and social economic drivers could be a critical part of looking to the future and being effective in our decision-making in the future as well. And finally, the pace of change is going to require that planning, that future prioritization of transportation needs and projects, and future implementation of those transportation solutions be extremely agile and adaptive, as we've learned through the pandemic that flexibility is going to be a critical component of our future. And looking to the future, there can be little doubt that approaches to planning transportation systems and investments will need significant rethinking. Transportation planners will need to work with and understand how the new normal for transportation may evolve. The foundation of understanding ensures that we reconsider our established transportation priorities and can more confidently determine the best path for addressing and managing the needs of that post-pandemic world that include economic impact as well as opportunity. I believe that this webinar has underscored the fact that the transportation community, and in particular transportation planners, must really therefore embrace tools, methods, and processes for evaluating a spectrum of possible future scenarios and maximize their ability to pivot swiftly and respond to the need for creation of that necessary future change. All in all, these trends highlight the importance of economic and multimodal planning and performance metrics to track progress in meeting future mobility needs. I'll conclude by thanking the experts that have joined us in speaking today. Thanks to those who have helped to administer this webinar and its critical information, Bing and Matt, and to the leadership, Fabio and Patrick, for allowing the Tech 1.2 committee to bring this particular topic forward through this webinar. That concludes my remarks. I will hand over to Patrick, the podium, for his final PIARC remarks. Patrick.
Thank you, Tim. My first remark will be to thank you, and together with Fabio, you have organized an excellent webinar, I think. And if someone does not agree, please say so in the chat, and we'll take that into account to improve our next webinars. But seriously, this was extremely interesting and enlightening for a topic that is proving really challenging. And one of the slides that Dejan showed, the matrix earlier in his presentation, showed how complex it is to prioritize investments and how to plan for actions by transportation agencies and road operators. So what we're doing in order to help at PIARC is we are planning future webinars. There's one planned in April or May. The date has not been set yet, on funding, procurement, and transparency questions. We organized a survey some time ago in September. The analysis of that will be published very soon now. And as you said, Tim, we are working extra hard to evaluate all the measures that have been implemented in a hurry during the crisis to identify which ones work, which ones don't work so well as to help identify actual user needs, even though those may shift over time. In other words, what's the new normal? And we can rely on our committees. They're all mobilized to continue sharing knowledge on the international level and sharing best practice. And again, that's a good opportunity for me to thank Christos Xenophontos, Chair of our Committee on Performance on Transport Administrations, who co-chairs the COVID team at PIARC, and Fabio, who chairs the PIARC Committee on Planning. So thank you very much to you, well, everyone, and to the audience and to the speakers. I think we can move on to the next slide, but that's more or less advertising. Matt, if you can do that. And I would like to thank you, Matt, as well, for the slide work. If you are interested in resilience and winter service, please note the dates. We are going to hold a virtual Congress in February next year. Well, we still say in Calgary, but it's going to be related to Calgary and to Canada. And that's going to be really, really exciting because that's going to be a first for us. So that's the end of our webinar. Unless Tim, you want to, or Fabio, Christos, you want to add anything, in which case I would invite you to turn on your microphone. And anyway, thank you to all of you. Bye.
Just a big thank you to everyone for both being here and the excellent work.